All right. Well, hey everybody. Sorry for the difficulties in starting the stream. I was using Streamlabs and I was trying to get the collab cam function to work and stuff like that. And Allan would join the link and then I can log in. So we don't have our normal start and stuff like that where, I've got the intro and all that. Oh, and then also I had the sound playing on my end of the video. But it's going to be a great video tonight. We're going to be reacting to Father Josiah Trenham's essentially objections to Catholicism and what have you. But Allan, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, my name's Allan. I run the show, I run the channel. It's just Allan Ruhl, ALLANRUHL. I love history and I like exposing falsehoods, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional falsehoods, but falsehoods nevertheless. And I like clearing up misconceptions.
Well, excellent. Yeah, guys, if you haven't followed Allan's channel yet, just look up Allan Ruhl on YouTube. He's excellent. And just as Allan said, I remember when I was getting kind of deeper in the faith, he helped me clarify a lot of issues, understanding early church history and objections to the faith and totally debunking them and stuff like that. And something I love about you, Allan, is you're just no nonsense, man. You just say it how it is. You speak your mind. You're courageous. I still remember when you got that one blasphemous rabbis book taken down, and that was awesome. I thought that was such a Chad moment.
Rabbi Mike Harvey, yeah. That guy's a piece of work. Now the thing is, eventually a Jewish company picked up his book and they published it, but that's fine. I don't care because Christians won't be reading it. It was getting published by a Christian outfit, Fortress Press. I think that's a Lutheran publishing outfit, and they're big into ecumenism, dialogue with Jews and stuff. And so his book is published, but it's published by a Jewish publisher, hence it won't be read by Christians. If Jews want to read that, they can. I could care less what they read. But that man is a disgusting human being, a piece of filth. The stuff he said about us, there is no way a Catholic priest could say that and not get suspended by his bishop immediately. And he shouldn't say that stuff about Jews. Just like a rabbi shouldn't say that about Christians, especially if he's a rabbi who says he cares about interfaith dialogue. Because if you care about interfaith dialogue, you should at least care about the faith you're trying to talk to. Even if it's care in a condescending way, you still need to care. And that guy just showed his hand. He showed that he hates us. So Christians shouldn't be reading his book.
Absolutely not. And it comes off as just we're always willing to have good faith dialogues with people when they want to know the truth and they want to talk about logos, right? But it's if someone's just going to name call and they're going to say awful things and stuff like that, there's no reason to talk with someone at that point. They're just looking to just evoke harm towards us, right? And not have an open dialogue that's respectful and what have you. So I think you're absolutely right on the money. Hopefully the rabbi's name, I can't remember his name, but hopefully we
Mike Harvey.
Mike Harvey. Okay. Hopefully Rabbi Harvey can one day reconcile with the faith and be our brother in Christ. I'd love to pray for that. I'd ask everyone watching tonight to pray for that intention. But now we got to get to the main show because I didn't just have you on here, this titan of YouTube Catholic content for nothing. We're going to be covering a pretty famous video by Father Josiah Trenham on his objections to Catholicism, as I said earlier in this episode. So honestly, let's get into it. I'm excited. And we'll just share it.
Yeah, let's go. And I do got to say this. I have nothing nothing personally wrong against Father Josiah Trenham. Although he does disagree with the Catholic faith, he doesn't try to take cheap shots or do cheap tricks or personally insult us or anything. He thinks we are incorrect on a handful of issues, which we expect. But like, he's not like Jay Dyer or someone like that. He's very professional in his presentation.
He's extremely good faith, and I even remember, surprisingly, he had a video on it was called An Orthodox Appreciation of Humanae Vitae, and he like spoke like glowingly about the great encyclical from St. Paul VI, which, you know, what's funny about that is actually today I believe it's St. Paul VI's feast day, so that's crazy that we're doing this episode on the same feast day of the you know, pro-life, pro-family, you know, champion that, you know, stood up for the church's traditional teaching on contraception and all that. So that's beautiful.
Yeah, and he has spoken at Catholic venues before, and when they had all those protests and they were toppling all those statues of Junipero Serra, I think he even like did a video on it and talked about Serra, how he brought the word of Christ to all these natives and stuff like that, even though he probably believes it was in a tampered with way. You know, at least they're learning a somewhat traditional version of Christ, and in the face of all these lies about Father Serra.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, anyway, that's a great description of Father Trenham. Let's get into the video. And whenever, Allan, you want me to pause it, I'll probably pause it too when I think it's a good stopping point, but feel free to just jump in and just tell me like, boom, 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 let's go off this point. So
yeah, and right before we start, I want to say one more thing. I don't know, since we're both fairly small, if Father Trenham will ever watch this, but if this does get to him, I'm sure PineSap will allow me to speak on his behalf. But if he wants to come on PineSap's channel or my channel to discuss these things, I'm game. I'm sure PineSap's game. Are you game, PineSap?
oh, absolutely. I have a lot of respect for Father Josiah Trenham, and I the invitation for a respectful, not even a debate, just a dialogue is always open. I would love to talk with him if he is willing to. I was about to call him, if I was about to almost address him as a bishop and say if His Excellency is willing to, but yeah, if Father is willing to dialogue respectfully, I'd be more than happy to. So let's get into it.
External affair, something that came upon us and which is still affecting us 14 centuries later. Nothing has affected the growth of the Church of Christ and its life in the world more than Islam, and nothing in the interior life of the Church has hurt us as badly as the Great Schism. That is the separation of the Patriarch of Rome from the other patriarchs of the East, and the functional separation, at least for the last 800 years, between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. We often, just for pedagogical purposes, like to use that date, 1054.
I was about to just say the same too.
You know what I'm gonna say?
That it was only really oh my goodness, I'm trying to remember his name. Patriarch at 1054. You know his name. Solarius. It was only Solarius who was excommunicated. It wasn't the whole Church of Constantinople.
Yeah, no, that's true. But I was gonna say something else.
Yes.
Like he's about to talk about 1054, but I think something that's worth pointing out is obviously he kind of skips over the previous schisms. Like, there's not a lot of Nestorians left, but there's still about 80 million Oriental Orthodox out there who don't seem to get they kind of get like airbrushed over. So I think, yes, the schism between the Church of Byzantium and its offspring, like the Church of Russia, is definitely a tragedy. But I think probably almost as big as the separation of the Orientals, because there's a lot of strong believers there. Like the Coptics are holding the line against the Muslims in Egypt and have been for over 1,000 years. So like I admire that. So like I'd love to have them in communion with us. I'm sure Father Trenham would like them to be part of the Orthodox Church as well. I mean, let's not forget them. I noticed that a lot of Eastern Orthodox have a tendency to, because it's kind of romantic when they kind of say we're separated from the East, as opposed to we're one of multiple Eastern schisms. You know, that's a lot less triumphalistic.
It kind of is. And on top of that too, there's kind of this idea with sort of the schism itself, to say, oh well, all the all the churches, all the patriarchates at 1054 separated from Rome. But when we look at the actual evidence for like who separated, I mean, really, it was, I mean, the main two schismatics, and maybe any clergy that followed them, was Leo of Ohrid, and because he was writing, I think you've heard some of his weird sacramental opinions. Like Leo of Ohrid did not believe that he did not believe, or he believed essentially that if you used unleavened bread to consecrate the Eucharist, that it wasn't actually the body and blood of Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. He believed that only if you used leavened bread, it was the body of Christ. And I remember that Saint Anselm, I believe it was the Council of Bari, where that was in southern Italy, rebuked that view, and he said, "Look, it is about the substance, right? It's about the fact that we're using bread in the consecration, and whether it's unleavened or leavened, it doesn't determine whether it becomes the body of Christ. It's only if the substance is the valid substance, right?" And on top of that too, sorry, I went off on that tangent, but on top of that, it's also kept in mind. So not only was it just Patriarch Michael Salarius and Leo of Ohrid that was excommunicated, but I believe Peter the Third of Antioch, who was the Patriarch of Antioch, rebuked Michael Salarius for his division with the Church at Rome. And even though Peter the Third of Antioch had some qualms with like the addition of the Filioque and stuff like that, he still maintained communion with Rome, and he still said this is important. And he rebuked him like so strongly that he said, like, you will harm Christendom if you fall out of communion with Rome. And he died as a Catholic. And on top of that too, I mean, I was even reading the other day, Allan, and I think you know this as well. The churches of the Church at Alexandria wasn't actually even in schism till really the 1300s, it's believed by historians. So you still had like, I believe it was Mark the Third of, it was Nicholas the First and Mark the Third in the 1200s, both patriarchs of Alexandria, who were still consecrating Latin Rite priests, who I believe it was Nicholas the First who actually sent Alexandrian representatives to the Fourth Lateran Council and still allowed communion to the Latins. In fact, there's this funny story where Patriarch Mark III wrote to Theodore Balsamon, who was the one of those famous Byzantine canonists at the time. He was Antiochian, about the question of communion for Latins. And Balsamon, of course, being anti-Latin, was like, no, they cannot be admitted to communion. and he just straight up ignores them. Like, he's like, okay, I disagree, and just, is giving these mostly Latin merchants Holy Communion, and still venerating, or still honoring the Pope in the diptychs of the liturgy, right? And same thing goes for Patriarch Nicholas I. So it's like, you're still having, long after 1054, this sense of communion between both churches. I even remember a funny story from Allan. You've probably read, I believe it's Henry Chadwick's the East-West Schism book, right?
A long time ago, but yeah.
Yeah, that book is crazy. Like, one of the things I remembered reading in that book is Pope Urban II writing the Patriarch of Constantinople, even like asking, like, yo, was there a schism between the churches? And the Patriarch of Constantinople at the time wasn't even aware of any schism going on. So he basically responds, he's like, oh no, there's just some issues we got to hammer out. So it's like, there was such this like loose view of like there being a great schism that we even might ask, like, until really the sack of Constantinople, was there really even a great schism, or was it a more minor rupture that later developed in that greater schism after the sack?
Well, I'm going to throw something else out here. This is something I have not spoken about on a video. I've talked to some other apologists in private about this, but I'm going to say this for the first time now. Based on my research into primary sources, I have read multiple primary chronicles of the Byzantine Empire in the 11th century. I've read John Scalitzis, I've read Michael Attiliates, I've read Michael Psellus, and they all, their chronicles go over 1054. And none of them, not one, mentioned the thing with Cerularius and Humbert and the Azymes and all that stuff. None of them even. Now, of course, these are secular histories, so it's not only about the church, it's also about current affairs, politics, military engagements. But it talks about Cerularius, and it talks about Cerularius doing other stuff, how he was schmoozing with opponents of the emperor and all that stuff. So it mentions Cerularius. They know who he is, but the whole 1054 thing with the papal legates and the Azymes, it's invisible. I found one source that just skims over it in a paragraph. It's some funeral oration, and it just skims over it. It barely mentions it in passing. It is really hard to find. It was such a nothing event.
That's crazy. You're telling me this for the first time. I've never heard this before. So, I mean,
sorry. Yeah.
Oh, no. I go right ahead. I just was like, I was amazed because it's like, even then, it wasn't regarded as this big, huge rupture or anything. Like that's almost in some sense, and you probably agree with this statement, it seems like a revisionism to give it more credence in like the minds of those living at the time than it really was.
Yeah, and I'm trying to find out. Like, I'm all about the primary sources. So I am trying to binge all the sources of the 11th century, both Latin and Greek, and trying to find when the rupture between Rome and Constantinople happened. And I'm trying to find primary sources on the thing with Humbert and Cerularius, because it is really, really hard to find. It's like invisible. It's absolutely weird. Like, this whole book, it covers from about 1030 to about 1080. It talks about Cerularius doing several things. Like, there was a coup against an emperor in the 1040s, and they accused Cerularius of being part of the coup. And then he was eventually found innocent. And like it talks about other things that he's up to. Oh, he got exiled by the emperor, but the next emperor invited him back. That's in Psellus, but it's such an invisible event. Again, I found only one source from the 11th century that talks about it, and it's only like a paragraph that just vaguely mentions it. The book's over there, but I don't want to take it because it's in a huge pile.
Oh no, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. But yeah, I mean, like the fact that that great schism, that great schism didn't really mean anything to the Christians of the time makes us think, was 1054 really such a great schism, or was it more an interchurch dispute? And I think even a lot of modern scholars that I've seen, even in the mostly in the 20th century, but I'd even say the 21st, didn't see it as a formal break of communion. Like it was sort of like, I would almost say it was a point in which there were very real divisions starting to show, so it's almost like, if you think of like a body, it's like, you see the stretch marks, but the arm isn't ripped off till, the arm's ripped off. Right. And I think with, the Great Schism, it was like, you could see the stretch marks. You could understand that there were already Byzantines who, Byzantine people or men who were writing, against the church at Rome, that were writing against, Asmace, bread and the addition of the filioque and what have you. But there wasn't that clean break till much later. So all interesting stuff. But we'll continue on and kind of address more of what Father Josiah is saying here. Also, as we play the video, I'm just going to get up and get my water real quick.
For the Great Schism, just so you know, nobody believes.
I do want to say one thing. I had gone over the letters of Pope Gregory VII, who is Pope from 10.
Oh, I can look this up real quick.
Pope?
Gregory VII.
He was in 1080.
Oh, okay. Here we go. He was
in 1074, I believe this letter is from.
1073 is when he started, and 1085 is when his papacy ended.
Okay, so in 1074, I think that's the year he wrote this letter. He did say that the Church of Constantinople and the Church of Rome had split. And he's planning to lead a crusade. The Pope's planning to lead a crusade. So it's very different than how it worked out 20 years later. But he wants to reunite the Church of Constantinople because they dispute about the Holy Spirit. They're talking about that he doesn't bring up Assyrians, he brings up the Holy Spirit. And he also talks about the Church of Armenia. He wants to bring them back in because they're wrong on Christology.
Yes.
So it seems like in the 1070s, there's some hint. Yeah.
Yes. That makes sense. Well, and that would also make sense too, because you likely also know this as well. St. Peter Damian was getting like inquiries from the East about the filioque, and he was writing defenses of the procession of the Holy Spirit as well. And I believe also the primacy of the church at Rome.
I'll be honest, I've not read the works of St. Peter Damian. I know he's writing at that time. I should probably pick up his stuff and read that because it's probably pertinent to what's going on at the time. So yeah, I'll confess I haven't read that. So
what I will say is though now I haven't read like the works like in depth. I've read excerpts. I know that I could actually get you the primary source for St. Peter Damian's work, because actually Dr. James Locutus reprinted it in one of his old books, and he'll like give you the PDF if you just email him asking for it. But I know I can't reveal too much to you guys, but let's just say Dr. James Locutus's books won't be out of print for too long. Wink, wink. There's going to be some developments there that I've heard about from primary sources. But in the back,
you'll have to tell me after the stream.
What did you say?
You'll have to tell me after the stream.
Oh, I will. You're going to be super excited. It's going to be awesome. And a lot of people are going to be really excited when they find out the news too. I think I might have actually talked about it on Telegram before, but I want to leave it as a surprise. But in the back of his book, Ending the Byzantine Greek Schism, he has the full, I think, like extract from St. Peter Damian defending the Filioque and the procession of the Holy Spirit. Because I believe there were either some monks, some prelates, or some priests from Greece that were writing to him as an inquiry about the Filioque, if I'm not mistaken. And both him and St. Anselm of Canterbury seem to be the main two people who were writing kind of in defense of the Filioque at that time. I also know, as we were speaking, because a lot of this knowledge that I've accumulated over time about these events, like kind of comes back to me the more we talk. But I know that Cardinal Humbert, I believe even prior to the excommunications, was writing a defense of Rome's primacy, and it had some cool Latin name. I'll have to find it again, but he was essentially trying to vindicate the Roman primacy against people who were challenging it and stuff like that. So all really great stuff, but I'll unpause the video again.
That at the time in 1054, no one in the West or in the East thought that marked the Great Schism, and that was somehow, the road that we shouldn't have crossed, and that was the end. If we really had to pin a date, I think a much better date to solidify the sense of the Great Schism is the sack of Constantinople in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade.
No,
it was at that time when the Latin Crusaders got...
He's about, okay. The Fourth Crusade is the one topic I've read every primary source available in English on. But before we get to that, I do want to say by 1254, they knew there was a separation. They knew at 1204, they knew their separation. Because in the 12th century, there's a dialogue between two bishops in Constantinople, Anselm of Havelberg, who was a German bishop, and a guy named Nicetas of Nicomedia. And they discussed three issues. Have you read this book?
I haven't, but I've heard a lot about the dialogue. I read about it in Chadwick's work.
It's a good book to read. It's not that expensive either. It's only about $35 Canadian, so that'll be like $28 American or something like that. On Amazon, it's easy to get. But they talk about three things: the Azymes, the Filioque, and the papacy. The papacy is actually a very small issue. There's not a lot of disagreement there. The big two are the Azymes and the Filioque. It's weird because on the Filioque, it's kind of in between Photius and Blachernae. It's gone beyond Photius, but it's not quite at Blachernae yet. So it's kind of like an argument that's kind of in its infancy. It's like a toddler. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, that does make sense. And that I remember hearing a lot about kind of the dialogue and how they were disputing various points about, like, Holy Spirit asme spread. I always am tempted to say azymes, asme spread, and then also the Roman primacy. And I remember actually when we did our first collab, like months and months and months ago, you mentioned that I believe that the asme spread was the largest or the biggest, most like disputed thing in that dialogue, if I'm not mistaken, right?
It's that or the Filioque. Like,
okay.
They take a lot on those two. But it comes to the papacy, there's not a lot, and there's not even that much disagreement. And he seems...
Because Nicetas is just kind of like, hey, you guys are bullying the other churches, from my recollection.
I don't recall that, but I don't know, but for sure the big issues are the azymes and the filioque. That's for sure. The papacy is very small, and we know by the mid 12th century that the papacy is making, like, this is post Gregorian reforms. It's undeniable what's being said, but
Right. Right. No, that makes total sense. We actually have a super chat, Alan. $10 super chat from Papal Groiper. He asked, what would you say?
Oh, throw it up.
I think it's on Power Chat, not on YouTube.
Okay.
But I can.
All right. What's the question though?
The question is, I will actually be able to throw it up. I'll just post it in the chat. So he says, do you think that the emphasis on the resurrection in the East versus the emphasis on the passion and death in the West had anything to do with the Great Schism, or was that a later split in theological emphasis? And the message just got cut off.
No, I don't think so, because you don't tend to find that on any of the lists, the complaints against the Latin Church. And you also don't find several other things, which our friend Father Trenham is going to bring up. And I can't wait to get into that.
That's going to be awesome. Great question, though, Papal. Thank you.
Misdirected, and they came into Constantinople and killed our bishops and priests and raped our nuns on our altars. That is when we said, you know what? I don't think we're one. That's when it really hit the people on the bottom. And I don't mean to demonize the Crusaders alone. We had done our fair share of slaughtering Latins just several decades before. For hostility.
Okay, this is the narrative. Oh, you big bad Crusaders because of 1204. The response is, oh, you murdered a whole bunch of Latins in the 1070s and 1080s. That's true, but I think it's pointless to check that to go there, because in 1204 I got a whole article on this on 1 Peter 5 where I cite all the primary sources, and in I make the case, because I know the Fourth Crusade. I've read every single chronicle available in English on the Fourth Crusade, as far as I know, including ones that are pretty darn expensive. And they're like they the Crusaders were used to complete a task. They completed their task of restoring Alexius IV to the throne, and his evil uncle had fled. And he didn't pay the Crusaders what they owed them, let alone do the other things he had promised them. And then eventually the Crusaders wouldn't go away, so he eventually he gets overthrown by a guy named Mortzophilus, who becomes Alexius V, and they attack the Crusaders on land and the ships in the Golden Horn. So in that event alone, there was crimes on both sides. Yes, we all know about the Latin crimes, but they have their fair share of the blame to go around as well. Anyway.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, you know, we kind of hear oftentimes this objection of like violence and what have you, but it's a lot more nuanced in the manner of, you know, as you said, like the Crusaders not being paid and this whole kind of dispute going on, that it's not just this simple, you know, big bad mean Latins narrative that we like to, or that we hear so often.
Yeah, and in terms of the killing, like he's like, oh, they killed our bishops and priests. The casualties were fairly low in it. Now, what was big is the looting. The looting was massive. All the churches were looted. All the palaces were looted. Like, all the gold was taken. All the relics were taken. Like how come St. John Chrysostom's relics are at the Vatican? Why? because obviously that crusade brought tons of relics back, and a lot of gold and a lot of artwork, and they just looted the city. In terms of casualties, it's only about 2,000 people. Not saying it's right, but that's what happened. And a lot of that was the Latins in the city who had been treated like garbage, taking revenge on the Greeks. So in terms of like, slaughtering them en masse, that's not true. But they did loot. The looting was immense.
Well, and compared to the Latin massacre, did the Latin massacre take many more lives than the sack of Constantinople?
Way more.
Oh, wow.
They killed a papal legate in the Latin massacre. They killed a cardinal.
That's right. And they tied his head to the back of a dog's tail, right?
Oh, you've been reading William of Tyre, have you?
I think so.
Yes.
I've been reading a little bit of that. Man, it's just messed up. And like, none of us are, of course, saying that like any massacring or violence or anything like that is right. But it's just like, it's kind of hypocritical when it's like we get chided for this event so much, which even the Pope condemned at the time, Pope Innocent III. You can read his letters like openly admonishing the sack of Constantinople and not being supportive of it at all. And it's like we're admonished for that, but then it's like the massacre of the Latins. I've even come across several, and this is of course not representative of most Eastern Orthodox, in the real world, but I've come across several Eastern Orthodox that will defend the Latin massacre, and they'll be like, "Oh, well, your Venetian merchants were overcharging the city, and so it was just due for what you were."
The trading privileges that the Venetians had were given to them by an emperor like 50 years earlier. I can't remember who it was, but they gave them those trading privileges. Those came from the government.
And yet we just never hear the end of it.
Yeah.
Man, it's crazy how it's much more nuanced than they make it out to be. But yeah, let's continue. Let's continue chipping away.
Sure. He had risen to a great fever. So now, while maintaining our Orthodox teaching about the Church, which is that despite the Great Schism, the integrity of the oneness of the Church has been preserved, our teaching is that you can leave the Church, but you cannot break the Church up. You cannot actually cause the Church to no longer be one. The oneness of the Church is an essential ecclesial characteristic. We confess it in the Creed to this day. So while maintaining the integrity of orthodoxy, that we, after the schism, continue to believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and that church is found in the Orthodox Church, not in the Roman Catholic Church. At the same time, I want to speak about the schism and the terrible diminution, the terrible loss to the church, to the one church that the Great Schism was.
Allan, are you cool if I pause it real quick? Because I did want to commentate on that, the Orthodox churches being one, if you don't mind me jumping in here.
Yeah, that's that's a bit of an issue in itself, yeah.
Yeah, so we hear Eastern Orthodox oftentimes say that, and when you demonstrate, like for instance, I've posted this meme so many times, but there's this picture, and let me see actually if I can pull it up here. But you have this picture, right, of I can't get it up. That's all right. But you have this picture that I've shared many times, and it almost looks like this like connect the dots graph where it's all the different like Eastern Orthodox jurisdictions and like what church is in communion with this church and what have you. And it's like a mess. Like it is a like sacramental mess, right? It's an ecclesiological mess, right? Like, you'll have like one church, like, maybe the OCA, and they're in communion with this church and that church. Oh, but they're not in communion with this other church over here, right?
Well, an answer they will give you for that is saying, well, they're just two bishops getting in fights. in terms of the doctrine, those two churches are the same. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that answer, but that's what they'll say. That's the hypothetical. Yes, there's some friction. There's been friction between the various Orthodox churches in terms of history, but the doctrine is the same. Again, I don't agree with that, but they'll say we're one in that sense.
Now, but that kind of brings up an important question, and I push back on that because, yeah, you could claim that you confess the same creed or something, but then what does it mean to be in communion with each other at that point? You know what I mean? Like, if I say, I mean, that's like saying like, oh, I'm one family with my mom and my dad, but I never talk to them and I've disowned them and I never have any communication with them, but we have all the same blood. It's like, well, I mean, yeah, you might have all the same blood, but if you're not, contacting them and you're not sharing in that that sort of unity with them, it's like, can you really say to be one family at that point? No, right?
Well, and in terms of, like, for example, let's take the most obvious case, the current schism with Moscow and Constantinople. That ecclesiology is based on theological claims, because the Patriarch of Constantinople claims to be first among equals. Now that Rome's gone, that title has moved to the Patriarch of Constantinople. And the question is, how much authority is that? Like a question to ask Orthodox, say, okay, if the Pope didn't have the Vatican I authority, how much authority did he have pre-1054? They'll say, well, he was first among equals. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? They can't tell you, just like they can't tell you, or at least they can't all agree on what that means today with the Patriarch of Constantinople. Is the Church of the Ukraine a satellite church of his, or a church of the Patriarch of Moscow? So, like, how much is primus inter pares, first among equals? How much authority is that? Again, they'll just say, yeah, the first millennium, Pope of Rome, first among equals. Okay, now Bartholomew's first among equals. How much authority does he have? Well, it's going to be different if you're under Bartholomew's authority or if you are an Orthodox Christian in Moscow.
Well, absolutely. And you probably even remember seeing this article too. The Union of Orthodox Journalists had this article where, Patriarch Bartholomew was essentially complaining that he's like, the idea of me being first among equals still means that in some sense, I do have a certain special power to try and like unite all the churches in some sense. And you even get this with Photius, right? Because Photius, I know Eric Ybarra's got a great article on this. Photius, when he was the Patriarch of Constantinople, talked about, the Patriarchate of Constantinople maintaining a certain unity in the East, right? And having a certain jurisdiction over the other churches in the East.
Well, yeah, but that's a lot to do with Caesaro-papism, which is a whole other topic that I've been researching left, right, center. And
right.
Again, I
have not that
conclusions. I haven't shared online yet.
Absolutely. And it's not to say that like Photius's view is necessarily like the one that the Eastern Orthodox hold today, but it kind of gives this, it almost kind of reveals the point that we're talking about, where there isn't this defined ecclesiology, because you'll have Bishop Hilarion, again, like then rebuking what Patriarch Bartholomew said in that, essentially in that interview, about him possessing a certain unitive power. And Bishop Hilarion will say, well, you're a papist, you're a papist heretic, and you're trying to exert your power over the church at Russia, right? So it's like, how can we really say that this is the, true church, churches of Christ, if there's all these ecclesiological disputes that haven't been reconciled for hundreds of years, or have even sort of shifted the goalpost depending on, really sort of how the course of history has treated these churches, right? Because as you said earlier, like, you know, Photius's claim was based upon Caesaropapism. Well, the emperor's gone, right? And he probably ain't ever coming back. So it's like you have a central piece of ecclesiology missing. So it's like, how do you recover from that? How do you operate from that?
Well, that is actually a fascinating topic. We can't get into it now, but I've been doing a lot of research on Caesaropapism, including, if people want to know something, I'll just say this out. Go type into Google, Patriarch of Constantinople, Antonius IV, letter to Prince something of Moscow. I can't remember. Prince Ivan, maybe. I don't know. Go look that up. You can find it online. Your jaw will drop. No Eastern Orthodox person on earth believes what's in that letter today. And he says that as a given. Because essentially they were trying to take the Church of Russia was stopping commemorating the emperor in their liturgy. Because at that time, the Byzantine emperor was essentially a city-state, and it was under the vassalage of the Islamic Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Islamic Ottoman Empire. So they had lost all respect for it. It's like, it's not an empire anymore. It's a vassal city-state. And so it could be Prince Basil. I can't. It's not important who it is either way. But it's important the topics he discusses. You can find that on it's available online. I know that much. But your jaw will drop with what you read.
Allan, you got to send me that after the stream's over, man. I definitely want to read that letter. That sounds crazy, like mind-blowing.
It is crazy. It is crazy.
You know, before we start again, I will admit, I haven't read this book in depth, but I was reading some excerpts from it. I think a really good nuanced perspective on like Eastern Orthodox versus Catholic ecclesiology that I think even Eastern Orthodox would find pretty fair, but still from, of course, a Catholic kind of apologetical standpoint, is actually Father Louis Boyer's, I believe it's called The Church of God. And he talks about Catholic ecclesiology in that, especially after, Second Vatican Council had just happened. And it's a wonderful book from just what I was reading. It's sold off Ignatius Press, but I find he's very fair in that book to the Eastern Orthodox. Like he doesn't like name call or anything like that. But like when he does talk about like Caesaropapism or like the influence it has, it's very scathing because of how nuanced he is. It's like if even someone who's nuanced is kind of like bringing up these criticisms, like, it's a pretty serious topic at that point.
I got to confess, I've not read that book. I like me, I don't want to brag. I have read a lot, especially in terms of primary sources. But if there's something I don't know about, I'll be the first to say I'm not an expert there. So I'll take your word for it.
Of course. We'll have to maybe read it together. Maybe we'll get a book club or something, but we'll continue on here.
And that separation brought a practical experience, a separation for Eastern Christians from a host of Western saints. In our experience as Orthodox in America, we often are bringing into the consciousness of our Orthodox brethren who are not converts and our Orthodox bishops who are not converts. We who are converts are bringing into their consciousness the experience, a new revived experience with Western saints before the schism. Many, many times I have interacted with parishioners or visitors who were converts, and they were catechized and baptized by priests who were not converts and did not recognize their names as authentic Christian saint names. Maybe their name was Chad. The priest didn't know that there was a magnificent Orthodox Western saint named Chad, and so he named him George in baptism. and he ended up not getting to be able to keep his name. This is a consequence, a terrible, terrible consequence of the schism, and that is that most Eastern Orthodox believers no longer had a practical.
Okay, it's not a huge issue, but just ask yourself, we have never had that issue in the Catholic Church. We know
We
haven't. We've always admired the pre-schism Greek saints. They've always been part of the faith. There's doctors of the church who were John Chrysostom, John of Damascus, the Cappadocians. In fact, if you go and read the Catena Aurea, the commentary that Saint Thomas Aquinas made on the Gospels, he quotes more Greeks than Latins.
He does.
Like, this has never been an issue for us. It's always been part of our. It seemed like everything, like if you're Byzantine in the 1300s, it seems like you've completely forgotten about pre-schism Latin saints. Obviously, you're going to say the Latins at the time are heretics, but no, it's like they've forgotten the ones that are saints. So,
well, it's so amazing because there's almost this like there's this attitude bordering on blasphemy. I mean, I remember Saint Augustine being blasphemed essentially by like Ubi Petrus, where he's like, Ubi is like saying all these like nasty things about Saint Augustine, and he had his like, of course, like Darth Vader voice on, and he's like, the Latins only read Saint Augustine because he wrote a lot and stuff like that, and it's like, you've got other I mean, actually, ironically, I think it was a metropolitan in Canada saying things like, oh, we don't even know if Saint Augustine's a saint. We know that he's called Blessed Augustine by like Mark of Ephesus, but Saint Augustine led to all this nonsense, and it's like
his writings were recommended in the ecumenical councils.
Yeah. And so it's like, what is with it, with this this revisionism where the early church loves Saint Augustine and venerates Saint Augustine, and it's like suddenly now, oh well, we're anti Saint Augustine, we're opposed to him, right? And it's not just it's not just Saint Augustine, but why is it that you have like Jay Dyer, these other people reading like Denny's papalism, and Denny is openly blaspheming against like Saint Leo the Great and like all these other saints that they venerate, right?
Yeah.
Like how is that the case? I mean, I've even heard orthos, you'll love this, Allan. You know that Pope Saint Liberius is venerated by the Eastern Orthodox, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and if you even go on the OCA website, like seriously, guys, after this episode, Google OCA Saint Liberius, right? They'll call him. They'll call Pope Saint Liberius, I think, Liberius the Confessor, which is a beautiful title. But they venerate Saint Liberius, and I've encountered Eastern Orthodox online who try to use him as an example of like papal infallibility being incorrect. And I'm like, you are resorting to blaspheming your own saints
because they are repeating Jay Dyer's garbage. And Jay Dyer, let's face it, well, on a couple philosophical things, he's good. I won't deny that. I've learned some stuff there. But when it comes to this stuff, he's just repeating the stuff from his old Baptist Calvinist days.
Absolutely. And he's making also points too that come off as very, like kind of pedantic, and like or I don't know if pedantic's the word. I'm trying to even remember the definition, but just these kind of repeated, tired old points that have been covered by apologists, well after the First Vatican Council. And I'm more familiar with his apologetics against the papacy, admittedly. But, points that have been made or answered by, Bishop, Christopher Butler, or, Cardinal Hergenrother, or any of these great and illustrious apologists hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And he's like throwing these out like these are new objections, Oh, man.
Yeah. Yeah,
You got the book out,
it,
Allan. I know you. I know you're gonna pull something good up, man.
well, I was just finding this. I'll share it with you after the stream. It's to do with something else.
Oh, okay, cool. I want to hear it after the stream. But yeah, I mean, needless to say, I think the whole point about like Saint Augustine and like all the Western saints is none of us have a problem venerating the Eastern saints. We venerate actually Eastern saints that go pretty late. Like, you know,
And it's not even a modern thing either. It's not even a modern thing either. Like you go to the days of Aquinas, they love the Chrysostom, John of Damascus, the Cappadocians,
oh yeah,
the whoever else. They
you
love
know
them.
who's one of the most quoted authors in the Cantina Aurea? It's Blessed Theophlact of Orid. And he lived and died. He died a Catholic. He accepted the papacy and all that, but he lived and died actually after the condemnation of Michael Celerius. And Saint Augustine quotes him like at liberty, and like is actually one of the sources he draws from the most. So I mean, it's
St.
like
Thomas. You said St. Augustine.
Or did I say St. Augustine? I meant St. Thomas Aquinas. My bad. Yeah, St. Thomas Aquinas is like quoting him at liberty. And it's like that's like well into like I believe Blessed Theophlact of Orid died in 1108. And so it's like we had this great love for the Eastern fathers. In fact, there's a book off, I haven't read it at all, but I saw the title, it looked great, called St. Thomas Aquinas and the Greek Fathers, about how much St. Thomas Aquinas was formed by the Greek Fathers and by the Eastern expression of Catholicism. And it's a great one to pick up.
Like, and for the Catholic, it's not so much the only reason we call them the Greek or the Latin Fathers is to say what language they speak. We believe that they all taught the same faith. It's the universal faith. It's not like we're like, I think what the Eastern Orthodox have done, it's like, okay, the Greek fathers are kosher. The Latin fathers, they're guilty till proven innocent. It's like, well, say they're saints because they lived a holy life. But in terms of their theology, it's guilty until proven innocent. It seems that way to me anyway. Feel free to disagree.
No, I would definitely agree with that. And you do get some more, you know, to be fair, you do get kind of some more ecumenical Eastern Orthodox that won't really treat it that way. But they're not well received because they're regarded as like heretics, basically, right? I mean, I remember there was oh, go ahead.
Well, like I'm just going to tell you a story. I was doing some private DMs with let's just call him an ortho bro, who's got a YouTube channel that's noticeable. Let's put it that way. I'm debating him in private DMs, and we're talking about a certain issue. I won't bore you with what issue it was. And he's like, "Can you name me some church fathers who taught that?" And I quote about 4 or 5 church fathers. Of course, they're all Latin. And he's like, "Yeah, but those are Western church fathers, though." It's like their opinions are completely worthless unless they're, I don't know. It seems that way, you know.
Well, you know, I mean, it's a certain ethnophilitism, you know. Like they officially condemn it. Their churches officially condemn it. You know, to be clear, I want to be fair, but it's like in practice, they really do kind of operate. Yeah. Well, and I'll give even an example. I remember Brother Augustine, who's he was a convert. He was like
oh yeah, I know who he is.
You know who he is?
Yeah.
Yeah, he you know, convert to Eastern Orthodoxy and all that. And I remember he visited a Western Rite Benedictine monastery, right? So it was Eastern Orthodox, but they were like Western Rite Orthodox, and it was a Benedictine monastery. And like in his comment section on Telegram, he's just getting like ripped into by people calling him heretics, people saying he's like you know, Frankish papist or whatever. You know, I'm not quoting verbatim, of course, but that essentially was like the crux of the conversation. And he's having to play like defense with apparently people who are united to him in the same faith, right? So I mean, it's so bad that you have even a famous example is like St. Mark's in Denver, St. Mark's Western Rite Orthodox Church, and they've got people on their calendar. They've got St. Bernard of Clairvaux on their calendar, which for anyone who knows St. Bernard of Clairvaux, he's like one of the most like high church papal, papist people in the entire world. I mean, he seriously has an entire book called On Consideration, which was written as advice for, I believe, Pope Honorius III, right? So, I mean, they're venerating him. They're venerating St. Thomas Aquinas. They're venerating St. Ignatius of Loyola. And it's like, and this is an approved like thing that they're doing. And so it's like, they go from either, it's like the Eastern Orthodox have no chill. They go from either venerating saints that completely throw off their entire ecclesiology to like refusing to venerate people who it would make sense to venerate, right?
Well, yeah, like, yeah, there's that. Now I know what they're going to do is, oh, you venerate, some uniates venerate Mark of Ephesus or whatever. And of course, that's a whole other debate. But I mean,
right.
Yeah, like I kind of, oh man, my throat. Sorry, I got no more water.
You're okay. If you need to get water, that's totally fine.
Okay, so take the reins for a minute or two.
You got it. Yeah. Yeah. Needless to say, though, it's very interesting because I've encountered this a lot online with Eastern Orthodox. You do get the objection like, oh, well, you guys venerate this saint or whatever. And I've talked about like the veneration of St. Gregory Palamas, and I've even debated with other Catholics about it. And no doubt there were some problems in his theology. I've said with him, I think it's kind of a St. Vincent Ferrer situation where, we could say that he was ignorant because he lived in the East, was separated from the Pope. And so anything incorrect he said was kind of more a mistake of just being, inculpably, or I think it's inculpable. Yeah. Having inculpable ignorance. Right. And also Mark of Ephesus is not officially venerated in any of the Eastern Rite churches. If anyone's venerating him, that's completely on their own volition. And he's not actually like per the order of the Eastern Rite churches being venerated in the liturgy or anything like that. Cause I mean, that would be ridiculous. He literally is like, he's like the Martin Luther of the East. Right. He's one of the worst people who's like ever cursed the face of the earth. But needless to say, it's like Eastern Orthodox can't decide what button they're on. I mean, I remember I even have a friend named Joey, who is a great guy, like an awesome dude. But he was telling me, he was like, oh yeah, we venerate St. Francis of Assisi in our churches. I'm like, dude, like St. Francis of Assisi, like one of the central charisms, the founding charism of like the Franciscans was obeying the Pope, right? It was obeying the church at Rome. St. Francis of Assisi even writes about this. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, then what is your ecclesiology? Is it really extra ecclesiam nulla salus or is it not? So needless to say, though, I think we've about hit all the points there. Let's continue on with the video. I think we've got a couple questions here. I'll check the power chat, not on the power chat, but on the chat, we've got, let's see. Sup, man, says Tank Lord. Sup, Tank Lord. Permanent aesthetic.
You've got permanent. Yeah, like I don't watch his channel too often, but I like Brother Augustine. He's a
great guy.
Judaism, I think.
Yeah, he did, which that's a tough jump to make. But blessed be God that he did. And let's pray that he becomes Catholic and a part of the true faith. But his book on Masonry, I would recommend, frankly. I've heard it's a fantastic read. Nice. Settlers Lament. Hey, dudes. Hey, Settlers Lament. What's up, man? I'm so glad we connected on Twitter and stuff like that. This guy's awesome. I've seen him on your videos too, Allan. But yeah, let's get back into it.
Experience a living connection with saints of the West. The progress of Orthodoxy for the last 100 or so years in the West, that this is one of the great contributions that we bring. And many Orthodox churches now have synodically confirmed new calendars. Russia, the Church of Russia, did this, for instance, about 10 years ago. They synodically made a declaration about numerous Western saints that weren't typically on Eastern liturgical calendars, and the synod put them on. This is a contribution. They did this because they have so many of their flock now in the West. We've done similar things in Antioch and other churches. We also lost many, many talents and unique gifts that Westerners possessed and contributed to the East. These talents and gifts, particularly in the area of missionary endeavors, Western Orthodox Christians prior to the schism were zealous and tenacious missionaries, and I would say for the most part remain tenacious and zealous missionaries. We also lost great talents in organization and achievements in Western culture. These things, when the church fell into schism, were lost to us. We also lost a wide diversity of liturgical rites. One of the consequences of the schism is that we went from being a pluralistic liturgical church that had numerous languages of liturgy, but not just numerous numerous liturgies. The West itself had multiple liturgies, not just the Roman Mass, but the Gallic Rite in Gaul and France, what is France today. We've had a fossilization, a diminution of what we consider to be the worship of the church. So now it's very hard for contemporary Orthodox Christians to have a grasp of the fact that there might be other edifying, fully Orthodox forms of the divine liturgy. For us, we pretty much know one.
So I am going to just pause it here, and we don't need to spend super long on this. But I've always used this as an external sign of Catholic unity, right? Because one of the things you'll notice, and you know this, Allan, is during, kind of the era of the Great Schism, I don't think you have any contemporary examples of Westerners, fleeing to Constantinople to say, oh, shoot, this schism happened. Oh, we know that the true faith is at Constantinople. No, you have actually the opposite, where you have Greeks who are saying, we know that the faith resides with Rome. And like, for instance, I said it earlier in the example, the Council of Bari, which was a more local synod, not an ecumenical council, but a local synod that Urban II, Pope Urban II, Blessed Urban II, planned out as sort of an early reunion council with the southern Italian Greeks, right? Because that area had been heavily Byzantine. It used to be part of the empire. And you have numerous examples of long after the schism, there always being the remainder of Greek Catholics, Eastern Catholics, right? Ones who never left. But it's like you don't have the same at all for the Eastern Orthodox. And I think, while I wouldn't rest my laurels on that argument, of course, because I think there's much better arguments you can make against the Eastern Schism, I think that for the just conscious observer is a good external sign of where the faith resides. And it's certainly not with the Eastern Schism.
Well, yeah, a lot to unpack there. No, I do appreciate what Trenham is doing here.
Absolutely.
essentially giving a history lesson, and he's basically telling, because he's given this talk in an Orthodox church where presumably his entire or almost his entire audience would be Orthodox, that he's kind of honest about the things that we lost. And like it's bad. It's affected us negatively. And yeah, like we could go on to this, but personally, I probably disagree with you. I don't think I would use this in a debate personally. I tend to focus on other things, but
I wouldn't either. There's no disagreement there. I wouldn't use that in a debate.
Okay.
I was more using that as, so like what I was using that as is if you read the book The Church of Christ by like Father Silvestri Berry, he gives really good proofs for like ecclesiology, like Catholic ecclesiology. But then he's got what he kind of calls like external signs, where it's not something you would ever use in a debate, but it's more like the fruit as a result of a deeper truth, right?
Interesting. Okay, yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I completely agree though. I would even say to the audience, if you're ever in a debate with an Eastern Orthodox, don't use like, oh, well, we have multiple liturgies as kind of like as a debate tactic, because it's not going to be a very strong point. I mean, it's like, the Anglicans, for instance, could do the same thing in a pinch, or, anyone else, right? But maintain rather, have this understanding that to the conscious observer, like someone who really is never going to be concerned with apologetics or something like that, which just by its face looks more Catholic and more unified. Is it the Catholic Church with, what with all her rites and her liturgies that have ancient roots, or is it this one Eastern schism that seems to be confided in a certain area of the world and largely confided to these nations, right? Even if it has members that are not of that ethnicity.
Again, to bring up research that I've been doing but haven't shared publicly, it's like an old relic from the Byzantine days, that's just hung around.
Oh, it is. Dr. Taylor Marshall actually brought up a good point. He's like, he once said very distinctly on one collaboration he was doing with Timothy Gordon, that they're kind of like a dying branch in a certain sense, right? Like it's taking all the like kind of old, relics from the Byzantine era, like the golden era, and it's just slowly kind of fading away.
Yeah, like a lot could be said about that. Like I think this is a talk in itself, especially with all the stuff I've been researching, but
Absolutely.
The role that the empire played. And I brought up that letter, Patriarch Anthony IV. That actually has a lot to do with that. I'll share the quote after the stream.
Nice. I definitely want to see that. But we can get back to the video here.
And everyone,
that was not the case. That was.
Oh yeah.
Everyone. Okay.
It's not the case prior to the Great Schism. We also lost a large portion of our army. A massive portion of our army. Now, at the time, population centers-wise, the proportions were not what they are today. Today, the Roman Catholic Church is at least 3 times the numeric size of the Orthodox Church. At the time of the schism, that wasn't the case at all. The vast majority of the population was still in the East. But nevertheless, when you have an army...
Okay, pause for a second. It's not... this point I'm going to make, if you take a look at the year 1000, I'm talking about Christianity in general, not Greek, not Latin, not Catholic, not Orthodox, just Christianity in general. So if you were to observe it from the outside, if you were a Muslim who lived in, say, in Egypt, and you look at the Christian world in 1000 AD, where is the center of mass of the Christian world in 1000 AD? In 1000 AD, it's in Constantinople. In the year 1000, the Byzantine Empire is doing great. They had probably their best emperor since Justinian, Basil II. also known as the Bulgar Slayer. That's his name, the Bulgar Slayer.
That's kind of
his
awesome.
nickname. Not if you're Bulgarian, you know.
It just sounds like kind of metal, you know, like the Bulgar Slayer, you know.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So like he was like it was a huge empire. They had conquered Antioch again. They were probably on their way to conquering Jerusalem again. He dies in 1025. His brother Constantine VIII takes over for 3 years, and then over the course of the next 50 years, tons of infighting, incursions of the Turks in the east, the Normans in the west, and then smaller groups like the Pechenegs, the Scythians, who were kind of related, and a whole bunch of other factors. By the time you get to 1100, the Byzantine Empire has shrunk tremendously to the point where you got the emperor in 1095 begging the Pope for help in terms of army. He's talking about army. So like the center of mass between 1000 and 1100, ignoring the schism, the center of mass of the Christian world had changed from Constantinople in the year 1000. By the time you get to 1100, it's in Rome or somewhere else in Western Europe, France maybe. But that's where all the political power was. In terms of population, I'm not sure. It's hard to find those stats. But like in terms of politics, the center of mass of the Christian world changed about the time of the schism.
That kind of makes sense. So you're saying that because of how well the Byzantine Empire was doing, like at the year 1000, it was much more populated than the West. But then kind of later on, that started to shift more the other way towards the West.
Well, I'm not sure about the population because it's hard to get those statistics. And like a lot of times populations are inflated and stuff like that. So it's tough enough to get the populations nowadays, let alone 1,000 years ago in a country we've never been to. But I'm talking about the center of political power had shifted, almost like God was involved, almost. But I mean, I'm not attributing this to well, technically God's in charge of everything, but like that's how a secular historian would point it out, that the center of mass had shifted from Constantinople, which was still an empire. The Byzantine Empire is still an empire, but it's smaller. Its army had dwindled, its land had dwindled, and it has to rely on mercenaries from the Pope to get some land back in the First Crusade, and land they would hold until the early 1300s.
Gotcha. That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I want to know something. Should I unpause the video and go use the restroom real quick, or do you want to hold down the fort?
Why don't you go to the can, because I won't be able to stop it.
Gotcha.
If there's something I want to talk about. So you go and I'll talk about some things while you're gone.
Gotcha. Yeah, everyone listen to Allan real quick. I'll just be right back.
Listen to me. Now, I want to share a book that I would recommend on this. I'm going to recommend 2 books. They're both cheap because they're both published by Penguin. The first book is called 14 Byzantine Rulers by a guy named Michael Psellus, Psellus. And it kind of gives the biography of 14 rulers, starting with Basil the Bulgar Slayer, Constantine VIII, I believe Michael III was next, Romanos, Michael IV, eventually. And it basically talks like pretty much after Basil the Bulgar Slayer, maybe after Constantine VIII. It essentially, there's the external problems that happen, but there's also the internal problems. It essentially turns into Game of Thrones almost. Sadly, it's unfortunate that happened, but that seems to be what happened. It was kind of the perfect storm. So if you take a look at the size of the Byzantine Empire in the year 1000, there's actually a map online, the size of the empire. I think you can find it on Wikipedia, 1025. It is huge. It is huge. It's controlling like all of Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey, parts of northern Syria. It controls Antioch. They got that back in the 1070s. And basically by the year 1095, they're reduced to, they've pretty much lost everything in Anatolia. They have Constantinople and part of Greece, but they're getting threatened by the Normans, who always love stealing the Byzantine land, it seems. And yeah, they're essentially a shell of what they were. Like, they're a fraction of what they were 100 years back. And to learn that, you should get that book, the 14 Byzantine Rulers by Michael Sellis, and a book called the Alexiad by Anna Komnena. This is the daughter of Alexius Comnenus, who was the Byzantine Empire from 1081 to 1118. He's one of my favorite Byzantine emperors. He's the one who appeals to the Pope for the Crusades. He does a whole bunch of stuff that's very important. I can't get into it all here. It's a great read, but those are two history books that'll give you, basically, it shows the change of fortunes from that time. Because in 1081, when Alexius takes over, the Byzantine army is like 300 troops. And they don't have a lot of cash. And so he kind of builds it back from almost nothing. Appeals to the Pope, and they get some land back in Asia Minor, and they don't get all of Asia Minor back. They don't get back Eastern Anatolia. That's gone for good at that point. But they get back places like Nicaea, Nicomedia, Dorylaeum, places like Ephesus. They managed to capture all that back, and that stays in their hands until pretty much the 1330s is when, basically the early 1300s, the Grand Catalan Company, a group of Spanish mercenaries, kind of screws them over. And then the Turks, at this time, you have the Ottoman Empire, and they're basically doing a number on them in Asia Minor. And by the 1330s, they lose their last two major cities in Asia Minor, Nicaea and Nicomedia, in the province of Bithynia, and they never get it back after that. They've lost all of Asia Minor at that point. All right, I'm getting off topic. Let's get back to the.
You got it. You got it. You did a great job holding it down, big guy. Awesome.
Take our army. How many soldiers do we have in the United States? How many soldiers in active duty? 400,000. Can you imagine going from 400,000 to 200,000? Change, and that's exactly what happened to us. And the schism from 1204, the tension between the East and the West, between the Orthodox and the Catholic, even our language had to change. Prior to the Great Schism, we were Orthodox and we were Catholic, and the two words were virtually synonymous. We use the words that way. Post-schism, by saying we're Orthodox, we're also saying we're not Catholic. And when a Catholic says, I'm Catholic, he's saying, I'm not Orthodox. And for about 700 years, at least from the time of the Fourth Crusade.
Until about the year 1900, they didn't call each other that. They would just call them the Greeks. We'd call them the Greeks. They would call us the Latins. It's only in the last 100 years we've started calling them Orthodox, them calling us Catholic. And still, not all of them even do that. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out. I think this is a fairly weak point he's making.
Yeah, and I mean also too, like even with the term Catholic, if I'm remembering correctly, Catholicos, right, meaning like whole of the faith, already implies orthodoxy, right?
According to the whole, yeah.
Right, according to the whole. So it's not just, and I actually like to correct sometimes our brothers in Christ on this, because sometimes they'll use the term Catholic to be like, oh, it just means universal, right? Well, it's like, but I mean, like, Mormons could be said to be universal because they have, missions like everywhere. But the term Catholic, while meaning universal, also means the whole of the faith, meaning we have the whole faith and not a single piece is missing.
Okay.
So
until the early part of the 20th century, the West took a very, very hard line against us. I know this is shocking. This is one of the realities of the post-schism Roman Catholic Church, is that despite its grandiose structure of authority and its projection of being the church that doesn't change, that church changes so fast you can hardly keep up with it. It is altering its positions and dogmas constantly.
Pause.
One of the things I'm going to do now is read to you.
Like he's talking about, he's essentially bringing up the example how we view the Greeks. We still have our disagreements with them. We just emphasize it in a different way, what we have in common to versus where we disagree. Now, some Catholics like to take it too far. They just like to ignore where we disagree. That's wrong. But I don't think there's wrong with emphasizing what we have in common. And the Orthodox do that too. Like he's doing that now in his last 10 minutes of his speech. He's emphasizing what we have in common, we still think they're in error on a lot of things. But we normally... we have not, like, okay, he talks about Thomas Aquinas wrote his Against the Greeks. But for the most part, we haven't really bothered ourselves with the Greeks since then. Not too much anyway. We've just been like going out preaching the gospel, and occasionally they'd be in the way of that, but just occasionally. We didn't have to, like the missionaries during the colonial period didn't have to deal with orthodoxy, so we were busy in faraway lands where they weren't a problem. So anyway, yeah.
Well, and not to mention too,
kind of an obsession with us for some reason. I'm not sure why.
I think heretics and schismatics generally have an obsession with the true faith challenging them. I always use this image. I always use this image like with heresy and schism. It's like when our Lord will give the Pharisees an answer, and it said, and they gnashed their teeth at Jesus, right? Because they didn't have anything to respond. If you feel that's also an apt description.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah.
And I know we're going to probably get into like the changes in the faith, but just a comment real quick. I mean, first of all, as Catholics, we all know that's nonsense. So we could go deeply into that. Why?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, we're changing left, right, and center. No, we're not. No, we're
right.
not.
We're not. and on top of that too, well, yeah. And it's like on top of that too, it's very rich. Not to be insulting to Father Trenham, but it's kind of rich hearing that from him, because it's like you have cases where, for instance, like the Russian Orthodox upheld the Immaculate Conception of Mary for a long, long time. And it wasn't until like really oh, go ahead.
So did the Greeks.
Yeah, so did the Greeks. I mean, Father Christian Kappas writes about how Mark of Ephesus believed in the oh, my ring light just turned off. Believed in this idea of the Immaculate Conception, right? And it's like it was only until we declared it a dogma that, and really kind of the influence of like the Slavophile movement being like anti-Roman and stuff like that, did they rebuke and reject that?
Yeah, like I don't think, like it's too big to unpack here. It just changes so much and so much, and like he's gonna try to show that with its his examples, but I think we're going to push back against those examples. But I mean, it's easy to say, it's not as easy to defend, especially against people like us who know the history. So
absolutely. Let's pause here.
A collection of what are called the Byzantine lists. Byzantine lists are compilations from different church fathers and bishops and scholars of the errors of the Latins that led to the Great Schism and followed the Great Schism. It's a whole genre, the Byzantine lists. But after I mention what's on them, I have to make this qualification. Those Byzantine lists are dealing with what's happening in the Latin Church until about the 13th century. There have been so many more changes, and forgive me, heresies that have been foisted upon the world by the Roman Catholic Church since the 13th century that we have to greatly expand the Byzantine lists. We have to make 21st century Byzantine lists. Now, saying all of that,
I think we might even
things did
agree
change.
with some of those. Like they might include some wacky Pope Francis statements and stuff like that, you know. But yeah, so just continue here. We'll.
Gotcha.
The beginning of the 20th century. Instead of the typical Latin line for 7 centuries that is found, for instance, in Thomas Aquinas's book that he wrote against the Greeks, which means against the Orthodox, just like we would say against the Latins, in which he said any Christian, any person not in communion with the Bishop of Rome is damned. That would be us. That position was radically altered by the Latins. First, tenuously at the beginning.
Nope. The moment he said that, radically altered. Nope. If Father Josiah is gonna claim that Vatican II altered that, there's a great book that I believe goes deep in this topic by actually Ralph Martin called "Will Many Be Saved?" And he shows how I believe Vatican II and like Lumen Gentium and stuff like that does not alter the doctrine of extra ecclesiam nolla salus.
Well, yeah, because I mean, if you take a look, everyone looks at Lumen Gentium 16. Now, we're not talking about exceptions. There's always exceptions because God's not bound by the boundary of His church, and He could save anyone. But we can't rely on that. You know, I think Father Trenham, as an Orthodox Christian, probably believes that as well. But True Faith Orthodox Church. So. What I would say is like people point to Lumen Gentium 16, but 16 does not make sense unless you read everything up to there. You need to read Lumen Gentium 14, and no one does that, because if you read that and you read Lumen Gentium 16 in the context of 14, you can't argue that things are radically revised or whatever, you know. So, yeah, that's not gonna work. Again, he's not bringing up any specific examples. That's one thing I got to say about Ubi Petrus. At least he'll point to it. He'll point and source it. That's why it's so easy to refute him.
Well, and you've done a good job. Like you and Elijah Yassi just did like an awesome job, like going through his arguments specifically and stuff like that. Like I was really, because I remember when his name started to get really hot first on the internet, and you know, like people were like, "Oh, are there any videos addressing him?" I'm like, "Yeah, Allan Ruhl and Elijah Yassi did a great job addressing him." And I even you know, found some inconsistencies sometimes in his work too, because he goes off of this one book written by a guy who I think most of the Eastern Orthodox would consider what they call a Fordhamite. Have you heard this term used, Alan? Fordhamite? Yeah. Like, so he's this professor at the University of Fordham. Fordham is a bad Jesuit university. It's barely Catholic. I'd say the last like truly Catholic person who like taught there or was one of its faculty was Cardinal Dulles, because he was a faithful Orthodox Catholic, but everyone else there is like bogus, right? But
it's trash.
yeah, it's
And
very trash.
the thing is, it pains me to say this because I know devout Catholics who have gone there.
Yeah, and it's crazy too because there's probably still some around, but I think most of the faculty are not devout Catholics at all.
Yeah, it's garbage.
Well, and I know that the book that Ubi likes a lot that he tries to reference a bunch is I believe it's called The Invention of Peter, and the front cover of it has St. Thomas Aquinas, doing like the shush, which is like I think a traditional icon or something. I can't remember why he has his finger over his mouth, kind of promoting silence, but I think it's like the silence of the heart or something like that's the meaning behind it. But essentially the thesis of that book is to try and say, look, the principle the first see will be judged by no one was made by the pseudo-Samakian forgeries, under Pope Saint Symmachus, right? And that thesis, Ubi Petrus goes off of. However, this thesis was actually debunked, and I've talked about this before, debunked by Cardinal Hergenrother when he wrote Anti-Janus. Janus was the pseudonym of an author by the name of I always think I mispronounce his name because it's German,
Yeah,
but
what's his name? Yeah, Dollinger, Ignaz von Dollinger. Yeah.
Ignaz von Dollinger, and he wrote the book The Pope and the Council, which is one of the favorite books of like the papal accusers, right? Like it's up there with like Denny's papalism or what have you. And Hergenrother, who was awesome at patristics, who was awesome at church history, he was like a prince of the church. He writes this book called Anti-Janus, and it basically goes over everything in that book and debunks all of it thoroughly to the point where you're not left standing. And in that book, he has an entire chapter where he goes over the papal forgeries, and he specifically covers the principle the first see judged by no one. Because Dollinger in his book makes the same claim as Ubi. The pseudo-Samakian forgeries invented this doctrine. It was never something taught by the church prior to it. But as Cardinal Hergenrother points out very convincingly, this principle already existed in the works of Pope St. Innocent I, Pope St. Gelasius, Pope St. Zosimus, and I believe maybe one other pope that I'm missing the name of. But that principle already existed in their letters and their allocutions to the entire church. So it's like all Pope St. Symmachus was doing was bolstering his claim when he was being tried, I believe, by King Theodoric in that one local council. Father Klaus Schatz, actually, though he's kind of a more critical scholar, also has a really good defense of Pope St. Symmachus in his book, Papal Primacy, where he talks about how the only reason Pope St. Symmachus had the Samakian forgeries was to get the principle more codified in canon law. So it's like he was trying to bring more like of a buff to canon law in order to solidify that principle. But it existed prior to him and prior to that whole dispute. Allan, you got anything to say on that?
No, I think you've said it all.
Awesome. Yeah, but we'll just continue on.
But yeah, I'm not a fan of Klaus Schatz. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I've always recommended with people, don't read him if you're really new to the faith and you're like really new, especially to papal apologetics. Like read someone like Dom John Chapman, which I think you'd agree, right, Allan? Like Dom John Chapman's like probably one of the first people you should start with.
This is where I part with most people, but I try as hard as I can to avoid like I've read Chapman, but if say in an alternate universe by this time in my life I had not read Chapman, I probably wouldn't have read him, because now I just read primary and early sources. Like this is 11th century Byzantium, this is a memoir from a missionary in Canada. I got like I'm all about the primary sources now. So like that's what separates me. I don't quote scholars because I'm not saying there's an odd one I don't read, but I just think if you do that, you're learning the opinions of men. You're not studying the facts and narrative.
I would definitely, I would agree with that, because I think in some sense too, sometimes with scholars, they might hold a certain opinion about like a work or something that you're like, well, it's like that old Wendy's ad. It's like, show me the beef, right? Like, show me how this quote proves what you're saying. Because like, I see the quote, I see what you wrote, but I don't necessarily know if I agree with the conclusion that you're drawing from it. Like a good example is
let me say something. He's going to talk about things in this, and we should probably pack it up soon. It's getting pretty late, but
yeah,
he's going to talk about things in this that I would not know how to respond to if I'd have just stuck with my knowledge derived from scholars. It's the primary sources that there is so much good against what he's saying. So much that's good. And like you can read the actual stuff, because if I quote a source, it's like, well, I mean, I don't like that scholar. My scholar can beat up your scholar. Like that's what it turns into at the end of the day. Now, technically, these sources, primary sources, are written by the scholars of their day, but at least they're scholars from that time. It's only one layer of bias. Yes, these people are biased, but it's only one layer of bias. Instead of quoting people who are quoting people who are quoting people, like 8 layers of bias. And yeah, that's why I try to avoid the scholar thing. I know almost everyone does that, but I don't know. It's me and the other Paul, who you're probably familiar with. He makes it a goal. He's an Anglican, but he makes it his goal to make sure to read all the primary sources. But
that makes sense. And I definitely think that sometimes scholars it's almost like a way of like easily streamlining all of the sources, where it's like, hey, rather than me going and reading this letter from Saint Athanasius, I'm going to read this scholar that ties his letter to something Saint Cyprian wrote, right? And it's kind of a way of like maybe streamlining it for some people, hence the popularity. Though there is an incredible amount of value, however, in just going to the primary source and reading it for yourself.
and you'll be shocked how much you learn. And keep in mind, a lot of these quote unquote scholars are academics at a university, and so they need to publish papers to keep their job. So like, sure, they'll publish a theory about maybe this is connected to this or something like that. What inspired this bishop or pope or emperor to say this? And that's how they keep their job, right? By just publish or perish. That's the mantra in academia. And so a lot of these quote unquote scholars have to publish it. So they're just publishing and they're just ranting to get their next paycheck.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I have a very low view of academia if you haven't figured that out.
No, that's okay. And honestly, I think you won't find yourself outnumbered by the opposite opinion in this crowd. The only reason I kind of almost read a bunch of scholars is I'm so new to everything that it's almost like kind of like me casting my net and getting a bunch of smaller fish, maybe, rather than casting my net and getting like larger fish, but less of them. But I definitely want to, I think, adopt your philosophy, Allan, of like going more towards just reading the primary sources and deriving like almost my own conclusions from those.
Start now.
I agree.
Yeah.
The change happens now. I'm gonna adopt the
if you want after the stream, I can tell you where to start.
I'd love to. Yeah. I know that New Advent would probably be an invaluable resource for that.
Yep, a lot of good stuff there. Yeah.
A lot of great stuff. But anyway, how much more? We're right now at 1:44. Do you want to go to 2 hours and then kind of cut it off there?
Why don't we wrap this up in the next 5 minutes?
Awesome. That sounds good.
Yeah, and then we'll just find out where we are, because he's just getting on a roll now. So,
of the 20th century, it came into full force in the middle of the 20th century. I have a book which is a collection of papal documents of the 20th century about the Eastern Church, and one after another they grow progressively more positive to us until they really reached a climax in Pope John Paul II's Orientale Lumen, which is a papal encyclical he issued, which means the light of the East. He, this Polish, remember who John Paul II was, this Eastern man whose mother was Orthodox, two of the three bishops who made him a bishop were from Orthodox families and were serving in the Eastern Rite as Catholic bishops. He had a great interest in Orthodoxy, and he was serving a Catholic church, which is even worse today than when he was serving it, in which the bishops did not obey him at all. He had virtually all of South America as communists in clerical robes, in promoting liberation theology, which is...
Pause there.
That's true. And there's a whole history about how that happened, by the way, in South America, but that's off topic. So,
well, and I did want to though comment, very disrespectful of posting St. Oscar Romero's image as somehow being liberation theology dissenter, example of a dissenter. He wasn't in the slightest at all. In fact, his private secretary talked about how St. Oscar Romero would actually, like, when people would bring in a liberation theology work, he would like ignore it and he would just read the church fathers. So his private secretary, go ahead.
Well, and keep in mind, he wasn't from South America. He was from Central America. But we I don't know if he did this himself. It might have been just an editor who threw this all together. Who knows?
Yes. It probably isn't him, but I just wanted to clarify for anyone who's confused seeing St. Oscar Romero's image. Yeah, St. Oscar Romero was not a liberation theologian. You can even read his personal secretary write about him and saying how he disdained liberation theology, hated it, was not for it, like, in the slightest. And he was very obedient to the Pope and had a great relationship with him, actually. You can actually find a bunch of images of him shaking St. Paul VI and St. John Paul II's hand.
Just communism with the Bible kind of draped around it. And he recognized that he needed a solid backbone. And one of the places he found it was by nourishing, once again, an interest in us. And he made explicit affirmations about the legitimacy of Orthodoxy. Not that we cared that much, but it was a nice...
legitimacy even mean? Like, I wish he would quote that encyclical. I've not read that encyclical in a long time. So, and from my understanding, if I recall, he talks a lot about the Eastern Catholic Church as well, right?
He does.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's he... Like, I don't know. I just wish he would quote it. Like, I'm glad he named the document. Like, legitimate. Like, what does that mean? Like, do you have valid apostolic succession? Yes, but that's something that we've always said. It's kind of like, we're not going to critique you on that. Just like Martin Luther thought the Bible was the word of God. We're not going to critique him on that. So that doesn't get brought up, except like modern ecumenical dialogue. But yeah, it's the movement to emphasize what we have in common. And maybe has that gone a bit too far? Not the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, maybe. In fact, I would say it has. But I wish he'd actually quote the source.
I wish so too. And this is something that I actually run into a lot with Eastern Orthodox online, where they claim that this conciliatory attitude towards them has been a very recent or modern development. But if you actually like look at the scholarship, and this actually, Allan, ironically, is where I was pretty strong with primary sources. There is a letter written by Blessed Pius IX right before Vatican I, where he doesn't just like invite the Eastern Orthodox to like even just look at the First Vatican Council. He invites them to participate in it. He invited the patriarchs and the bishops to participate in the First Vatican Council, and they of course rejected his plea. But he was incredibly conciliatory. The Pope that they seemingly disliked the most, because it was under him that the doctrine of papal infallibility was enunciated in its full clarity. But it's like he was writing letters to the Eastern Orthodox patriarchs themselves with a very conciliatory and brotherly attitude that they would only suspect as being, the post-Vatican II church. Doesn't make any sense, right?
Where are we at now on the, like, what's the timestamp on the
17:15? So 17 minutes 15 seconds. So to give everyone a little brief,
a night here.
Yeah, just to give everyone a brief, me and Allan are gonna do a part 2. Where we'll go over more of Father Josiah Trenham's video. And I'm sure we won't be able to go over every nook and cranny, but we can definitely get more content out of this. Allan, I know we had a rocky start with the stream, just with the technical difficulties, but this has been great.
Yeah, no, it's been good. I like collabing again. I'm trying to reach out to all the people I've collabed with in the past, and I'm like, hey, let's do more. Like, I'm probably going to send Elijah Yossi a message soon. I did so much stuff with him, but we've kind of fallen out of. But yeah, no, and a few other people, plus some people I haven't collabed with, trying to do more. Yeah, let's call it a night. I got something to do before I go to bed. So
you got it. Well, thank you everybody for joining me and Allan tonight. Be expecting a part 2 coming out probably in maybe next week or something like that. And thank you guys all for watching. This was a great episode, and we will talk to y'all later. And I'm just going to make sure there were no super chats. Awesome. We're good. God bless everybody and have a good night.